This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on April the 27th, 1967. The interview is conducted by Mr. Guy Ross. The interviewee is Mr. Roland V. Rodman, Rodman, of Oklahoma City. This interview is being re-recorded on June the 3rd, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is April the 26th, 1967. I'm in the office today of Mr. Roland V. Rodman, who's the president of APCO Oil Corporation. Mr. Rodman, why don't you begin by discussing the beginning and development of the company?
Well, the APCO Oil Corporation is a part of what was formerly the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation. The Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation was formed in the early 20s as a partnership between Mr. J. Steve Anderson and Lev H. Pritchard. Mr. Anderson was a real estate man. Mr. Pritchard was a Mississippi lawyer. And they came to Oklahoma when romance and the possibilities of business were greater than the areas from which they had come. After they arrived here, they concluded to enter the oil business, and they formed a partnership for that purpose. One complemented the other, the one being the analytical, real property evaluator, and the man who could analyze business deals generally, the other being a lawyer that could organize the deal and the participation in the deal on a basis that would be beneficial to both. From that small beginning, these men developed the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation. First as a small producing corporation, then as an integrated producing, refining, and marketing company. Mr. Anderson stayed with the company until 1946, at which time Mr. Pritchard purchased his interest in the company. And at the same time, Mr. Pritchard then sold 3/4 of the total stock in the company to the public, and the company then became a publicly owned corporation. After Mr. Pritchard's death, the principal portion of the Pritchard estate was in the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation. The trustees and beneficiaries of that estate realized that good business would require that the estate be better diversified than to have all of its eggs in one basket, namely the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation. And for that reason, the corporation in 1961 elected to sell and dispose of its assets. To obtain this diversification, that was necessary because market-wise, the stock of the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation was selling for about $30 a share, whereas the underlying assets had a great deal more value than the current quotations. So by making a sale of those assets, the stockholders of the Anderson-Pritchard Oil Corporation were able to obtain $50 a share for the stock. This was a substantial sum and resulted in receiving a check for $123 million in the sale of the corporation.
Let me interrupt you to ask you a question here. I'm wondering what the main problems would be for them as they looked forward to developing this company. They were already major companies in existence. And
The
so
main problem was that all of the assets of the Pritchard estate were in the Anderson Pritchard Oil Corporation, and there were no Pritchards left. We had then been transferred to an outside management, outside the family. I had become president of the Anderson Pritchard Oil Corporation in 1947, and we'd had substantial development between 1947 and 1951. But there's no way to realize the underlying asset value of the corporation except by the sale. And only by making the sale were the Pritchard interests able to diversify their investments into many fields.
now, back beyond this, even when they in the 20s, when they developed the company, what would have been the main problems that they would have had to encounter to be successful in the business?
Well, they had many problems. The company was organized at a time when there was very little credit extended to small operators. It wasn't until the 30s, probably the 34 or 35, that we had conservation laws passed limiting the production of oil to the current market demand. Prior to that time, there was no control, and if you owned an oil well, you'd produce it at capacity and take whatever you could get for what you produced. This resulted in the price of oil going down as low as 10 cents a barrel in East Texas and as low as 25 cents a barrel in Oklahoma, which completely demoralized the oil business. Then, with the passage of conservation and proration laws, we had stability restored because the production was limited to market demand under the police power of a state to regulate waste. And by virtue of that fact, credit became available to men like Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Anderson to pursue the development of an oil company. And incidentally, the First National Bank of Chicago, which was one of the great oil banks of the country, made the first oil loan that they ever made to the Anderson Pritchard Oil Corporation. In 1961, as a part of the sale of the Anderson Pritchard Oil Corporation, the APCO Oil Corporation was organized. It was organized for the purpose of taking over the refining and marketing operations of the Anderson Pritchard Oil Corporation, and has done very well. The APCO Oil Corporation ranks well toward the top on the rate of return on our net investment, as well as the rate of return on our gross sales. The APCO Oil Corporation's headquarters are, of course, in Oklahoma City, and we distribute refined petroleum products in the 12 mid-continent states. We have about 1,400 identified outlets handling APCO products.
Let me ask you, now, you discussed a little bit the problems that they would have had in the 20s and 30s. What are the main obstacles, if that's a good word to use, that you encounter now, as far as does APCO deal with exploration?
Yes. Well, the main problems that we have now is the question of competition. Many of our larger competitors are engaged in more lines of endeavor than we are. They're engaged not only in exploration, production, they're engaged in the sale of natural gasoline. They have great chemical organizations. They own pipelines and transportation. They are engaged in foreign operations, which gives them many opportunities for profit that have been denied to the APCO Oil Corporation by virtue of the meager start that we had. However, the APCO Oil Corporation is now back engaged in exploration and production. We've produced something better than 5,000 barrels a day, which we've developed just in the last 3 years. We are also moving into the international field, and we're moving into the field of fertilizers and chemicals. One of our principal operations right now is Trans-Ammonia Corporation, which we operate out of New York, which is engaged in the international handling of asphalts or of fertilizers and chemicals.
Can you define your philosophy of competition? Would it be to...
Well, in a free enterprise, we must have competition. It's only when you surrender your freedom that you eliminate competition. And I would be the last to say that freedom should ever be surrendered. Statism means stagnation. It doesn't mean growth. We could not have had the growth that we've had in this country had we not had very active competition. Now, it's true that sometimes the competition gets so tough, or they get so big, or they have such full control of an industry that they can dominate that industry, either to the advantage or the disadvantage of their smaller competitors. But those are we must, if we are to enjoy all the benefits of rigorous competition and freedom, we've got to assume the risks of tough competition with competitors.
I know that to the layman, I, for instance, would think of the gasoline business as the most competitive business I can think of because of the frequent gas wars and things.
Well, the gasoline business is the most competitive business. But you must remember that a company of our size, which incidentally was rated by Newsfront as the 6th most efficiently operated oil company last year, have many advantages over our major competitors. We can move more quickly. We have less dead wood. We have greater individual responsibility on the part of the people working here. We can produce oil cheaper. We can process it cheaper. We can market it cheaper than our competitors. So as long as our competitors do not engage in sales below cost, there is ample room in the marketplace for us to go forward.
That's very interesting. Do you think that there are any particular problems presented with imports?
We do have problems of imports. In the United States, which has been the source of, in the past, of most of the crude oil that was produced, we have costs of production that are greater than the costs in some of the flush fields offshore at this time. The average oil well in Oklahoma produces 6 barrels per day per well. In Venezuela, the production runs 200 barrels per day per well, while in the Middle East, we've had many years in which the production amounted to better than 5,000 barrels per day per well. Now, such flush production brings about a great disparity as to costs. Therefore, we had to have some type of an import program, because America could not afford to become dependent upon foreign oil. During World War II, 65% of all the tonnage moved by ships, which included the men, or the weight of the men that were transported, 65% of all of the tonnage was petroleum products. Petroleum products powered the ships in the sea, the planes in the air, the tanks in the field, and all movement of materials. Hence, we do have an import program in the United States, and that import program was designed to keep America self-sufficient in petroleum products, both in war and peace, and that is its only justification.
Do you think, therefore, that we ought to have tariffs, curbs, or what?
No, we do not need tariffs. The trouble with a tariff is that a tariff, to be effective, must assume that the cost of operation outside of continental United States is uniform. Now, if we would place a high tariff on oil, since the Middle East has the lowest cost oil, they could continue to bring oil in here on most any basis. Well, since Venezuela has a higher cost than the Middle East, the tariff might exclude Venezuelan oil, which was the most acceptable or accessible oil we had during World War II. Or the tariff would probably exclude Canadian oil, because the cost of production in Canada is similar to that in the United States. So we are better off to have a system similar to what we now have than to have a tariff on oil.
Before I started shooting these questions to you, you had come up to APCO now in the present tense, and I don't know if I crowded out some things you intended to say or not.
No, I don't think so.
Well, in that case, I'd like to ask you to trace something of your career and then bring it up to your involvement with APCO.
Well, there's little to be said on that. Basically, I was reared in Nebraska and was graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1919 with a law degree. Thereafter, I practiced law, the general practice of law, for 19 years. And then I moved to Denver, Colorado, and became the attorney for the Bay Petroleum Corporation in 1937. And a couple of years later, I became the executive vice president of Bay, and a year later became president of the Bay Petroleum Corporation. In the Bay Petroleum Corporation, in the 8 years that I was there, we started from a lost position, a small company processing 6,000 barrels a day of crude oil and having no production of its own. 8 years later, we were processing 26,000 barrels of crude oil a day, and we're producing 6,400 barrels a day of our own oil, and making about $3 million after tax.
What steps did you take that resulted in this?
Well, just trying to build an organization and a company a brick at a time. Then in 1947, I came to the Pritchard Oil Corporation and came here as president of the corporation. Mr. Anderson was gone at that time, and Mr. Pritchard was desiring to withdraw from activity. Mr. Pritchard passed away in 1949.
Did this involve considerable adaptation on your part, coming from strictly the practice of law into the presidency of an oil corporation?
Well, I didn't come directly. I had about an interim of about 2 years when I was working for an oil corporation as a lawyer, within which time I had an opportunity to familiarize myself with the problems of the industry.
Your legal training has no doubt been a considerable asset to you.
Oh, I think so.
Well, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your general philosophy. I know you've already commented on your philosophy of competition, and it occurred to me as you were talking about change and about the things that the way APCO has changed and getting in the fertilizer business and so forth, that you must have some thoughts on change or keeping up with change, or this presents a big trauma for some people.
Well, I don't know whether you're exactly what you're directing your remarks at, but right now we're going through a tremendous change as we go to electric data processing. It's a new innovation for all industry. It's something that is revolutionizing certain of our concepts on operation and investment. It's giving you figures more rapidly than we ever had them before. It's enabling you to set goals for return on investment and have an almost immediate response to the question of your rate of return. It enables you to see the red flags quicker on the weaker parts of your business than we could before. But the question of change is not something that should ever challenge management. Management should be able to embrace change and manage change as well as they can manage anything else. So it isn't something we should be afraid of. There is, within my lifetime, of course, there's been a great transition in business. Most of our great American corporations, someone has said, were just the shadows of some one man, like Ford, or Rockefeller, or Carnegie, or maybe Edison, or maybe Eastman, or the early DuPonts. These were family ventures where the owners of the business ran the business. Today we've entered into a new situation, or within my lifetime we've passed into it, and that is one of professional management. Because the owners of the business basically no longer run it. It's committed to professional managers. Very often you find boards of large corporations who do not have much stock in the corporations. And certainly we find the officers of corporations who have no control over the corporation. The control has passed to the investment trusts, the stockholders, scattered over a large area, and so the whole method of operating is much different than it was. Corporations today can't have the attitude that we had when the robber barons were in existence, and that was generally that the public be damned. A corporation today has got to recognize that it not only has an economic responsibility to its stockholders, a definite responsibility to its employees, but it's got to be a good company for the community. It's got to be a good company to work for, a good company to buy from, a good company for the community, or our whole structure falls down. So corporate philosophy in the last 50 or 60 years has seen a great transition from the public be damned to the public be served.
So that corporations as a whole now, you would say, then feel a great deal more social responsibility than they
Oh,
did
yes.
a long time ago.
Yes. Now, this was a necessary thing in this country. We are a very young country. I was impressed at a luncheon that I attended yesterday. To look at the storybooks, you'd think that perhaps J.P. Morgan was in ages long gone. Yet I sat opposite his son at this luncheon, only indicating the short period of time that America has been going forward with its growth and development. When our Constitution was adopted, which is only about 175 or 80 years ago, we were an agrarian country. We had 95% of our people that were directly dependent upon the soil for their support. They grew their own food. They combed their own wool. They made their own yarn and wove their own clothes. When the Constitution was adopted, we only had 6 towns who had a population of more than 5,000 people. Now that we've gone into a situation where we have only about 10% of our people who are dependent upon agriculture for their support, we must recognize the transition that's taken place. This transition has not only affected us, that is, the mechanical developments in transition, have not only affected us from a standpoint of economics and corporate operation, but also from a standpoint of governmental operation. We used, I think, to try to send the smart men of the community to the Congress and to the Senate, because once they got there, it might take them 3 or 4 weeks to reach there on horseback. And once they got there, we were wholly dependent upon their judgment as to what to do in our behalf. That is no longer true. With the development of the radio, the television, and the daily press, we ordinarily think we know about as much about what's going on in Washington by the close of the day as the people in Washington, which has changed us from a representative government to a different type of government. Now the man who aspires to public office is likely to aspire to public office based upon what he can promise to get for the people, rather than the service that he can perform for the people.
Do you think this is the total effect of this is bad or good?
No, I think the total effect is bad, because we've now reached a point where we recognize the central state as being responsible for all people. And whenever we relieve the individual of responsibility, we suffer something of a general decline. Nations are just like individuals. Individuals progress according to their energy and their ambition. So do nations. But when either lays down and waits for somebody to bring them something, progress is halted.
Has your philosophy, I know that you mentioned in our conversation before that you were a Democrat some years ago and delivered, I think, the Democratic keynote address in Nebraska.
No, I was reared a Democrat. My father was a very ardent admirer of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, the man that could never be elected president, but has had more effect on the Constitution of the United States than any man that ever lived. William Jennings Bryan was among the first, as a young congressman, to advocate the income tax. He argued the legality of the income tax from a constitutional standpoint in the United States Supreme Court. The court declared it to be unconstitutional, but nevertheless we had to have an amendment to the Constitution providing for the income tax. William Jennings Bryan was one of the first to ever advocate equal suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt and some of these people were on the sidelines, but as a public character, Bryan was the first. And we have an amendment to the Constitution on it. William Jennings Bryan was proposed the amendment to the Constitution that provided for the direct election of United States senators. And we have an amendment that provided for it. William Jennings Bryan, under the Wilson administration, was the proponent of the Prohibition Amendment, which was enacted, but of course it's since been repealed. But nevertheless, here's a man that could not be elected to public office, or could not be elected to the presidency, that probably did more to change our constitutional form of government than any other single individual. You see, we haven't had too many amendments after the first 10, which were adopted as a part of the Bill of Rights.
Well, hey, do you think that would it be incorrect to say your philosophy toward government or of government has changed?
No, my philosophy hasn't changed. I'm still a Democrat at heart.
Well, hey, do you think that would it be incorrect to say your philosophy toward government or of government has changed?
No, my philosophy hasn't changed. I'm still a Democrat at heart. And I thoroughly believe with Thomas Jefferson that the least governed are the best governed. I believe with Grover Cleveland that it's the duty of the citizens to support the state and not the duty of the state to support the citizen. And these are the things that tear us down. In summary, I might say this. One of the great dangers that we have is the relieving of the individual of the responsibility for his own condition. That goes back to liberty. For so much as you become dependent upon the other fellow, to that extent you surrender your liberty. You become a dependent instead of an independent. Now, liberty starts out just as the gleam in somebody's eye, because we've all come down from systems of the lord and the master, the serf, the slave. All of our civilization today has descended. In Rome, in Greece, we've seen times when there were more slaves than there were citizens. So there's been a dominant group and a servient group. Well, liberty starts out when the servient group has a gleam. One fellow perhaps starts it in a given area. Soon others catch the gleam in his eye, and they think and dream of liberty. So finally they strike out for liberty, and they obtain it. Up to the time that they have had liberty, everything that they have produced belonged to someone else. After they gain liberty, that which they produce belongs to them. When they receive what they can produce, they have abundance. And after they have abundance, they have lethargy, just as we have in this country. Our better people are now above the gutter type of politics. They think, oh, that's somebody else's job, let him do it. So we've gone through a lethargic period in this country merely because we had too many people become too prosperous. They didn't have to get out and fight for a position. And now, following this lethargy, if we follow the pattern of other nations, we will finally do away with the form of government that we now have. Because when we become all tax eaters rather than taxpayers, the government as such has nothing, of course, and when that time comes, why, we are going back to the jungle again with some new form of government, which will probably take the type of a strong central power. Someone will have to come along, very strong in character, in order to straighten out the messes that we have permitted ourselves to drift into. we now have a situation where I guess we owe some $1,400,000,000,000, which can never be paid. When we have complete dissolution, it'll take some strong leadership to reorient values and put our whole system of thought and action back on the right track. And then we will probably strike out to obtain liberty for the individual, because then we will again restore the belief that the citizen can do better for himself than the government can do for the citizen. Why do we quit?
That's very interesting.